I should say that my background is not in architecture or design or even urban planning. I have a background, my formal training is in social science, mostly economics and public administration. So I'm more involved in how society is organized, how governance occurs, and how communities function, that sort of thing. I chose today to talk about the topic of the importance of how people and communities participate in their housing and the importance of that. So let me just go to the first slide. Housing has many functions, not just shelter, though that's the function that public housing programs very often focus on almost entirely. So the shelter function is, of course, very important and something that needs to be subsidized in many cases. But it also has important economic functions. For most of us, owning a home is the biggest investment we make in our lives, and having the freedom to use that investment in any way we see fit is a very important part of buying and owning a home. Either to resell it at a higher price later, or to rent it out for income, or to use it as a workplace for our work. These, by the way, are very often intentionally restricted in the case of low-cost housing. The social status is a very important factor in housing. Where you live, what community you live in, what kind of a house you live in says a lot about your status within society. And at the moment, if you're living in a low-cost flat, what it's saying is not very good. So it's something that we also need to think about. It also has the function of providing access to a community, a particular community. Many places here are gated communities, and very intentionally excluding the rest of society from the community. But it also provides access to health, education, and social services. And finally, its location is very important in terms of access to infrastructure, particularly public transport, which, by the way, is probably the biggest problem that Kuala Lumpur, I think, needs to face, is what to do, because car-based transportation systems are the least efficient way to get people around in cities and take up an enormous amount of space for parking and for superhighways, etc. And in the end, we all still end up in traffic jams for hours and hours. So having a better public transportation system would be a very important investment for the future here, and particularly for the lower income people. Basically, owning and managing a car in this city probably means, if you can do it, that you're not one of the lower income people, because it's just too expensive. And then I think one of the issues we have to think about is this term social housing. Merely substituting the term social housing for low cost does not change the nature of it. But social housing has implications. It means that the housing has to do more than provide shelter. It has to provide services and access and community that makes it really a social institution. So besides providing a healthy environment and shelter, it should provide, as we said earlier, education, health, and social services protection. And this factor, the poverty reduction, in a sense, the way low-cost housing is done now, it puts low-income people into a situation where their house cannot be used really to promote their business or to increase their income, or because they can't resell it, they can't rent it out, and because of the design of it, high-rise buildings, it's not really usable as a shop and it's difficult to use as an office space unless you've got good Wi-Fi, which, by the way, I think is an important aspect of social housing that in this day and age is absolutely essential for anybody at any income level, as that's a pretty good Wi-Fi connection, because that's where the future is for all of us. And then I think that social housing, by its nature, should be used to help empower and organize people to play a more active role in society and in governance. And finally, we need to support the broader urban and environmental sustainability for the whole city. And so this is a tall wish list of things that social housing might become, but nevertheless, I think it's useful as a framework to think about how we now do housing for low-income groups, which is not, I shouldn't say anti-social, but certainly not what I would consider to be social housing in a broad concept. Okay, I just threw this in because I think there are particular groups that we often don't realize we're excluding. One is women-headed households, and I might add there single-parent households. Having had a period in my life when I was a single parent, I feel that it's discrimination to say only women-headed households should be an issue, but I think single-parent households are important. Just people who are single is an important aspect of society, a growing aspect of society, and needs to be also catered to by our housing system. The disabled, of course, we often don't realize that, for example, access here for a disabled person would be really problematic because there's all those stairs out there you have to negotiate. And at almost every place you go, disabled access is limited or unavailable. Elderly is an important group, and I really empathize with the elderly because I'm well over the age where other people are considered elderly. Of course, I'm not, but for people over 70, usually they have many disabilities as well, just as a function of age. Migrant workers, this is an enormous group of people who are very often explicitly excluded from studies or from programs because they're temporary, although in the end many of them end up being permanent. So dealing with the issue of migrant workers, I think, is critical. The homeless, and I was noting that one of the people who's involved in this project at the UNDP, we're doing it, works with a homeless group in society. I haven't had a chance to talk with her yet about the work she does, but there are many homeless people in any city, and that certainly includes the cities in the United States to a shocking degree, actually, but also here. But they are very good at going below the radar, so to speak, sleeping in a park and getting up and getting clear before the sun rises, sleeping on a heating grate in the US where the winters are cold, and so on. So the homeless are always with us. And then what I call informal settlements, which are often called squatter settlements here, which in Indonesia we called kampungs, and which is also a term used here. But in Indonesia, because the great majority of people lived in kampungs, it was not a pejorative term. It was just the way people live. And so the work there was making kampungs work better for people. Anyway, some of the problems that arise because people have not been involved in or consulted in is that the location and design of low-cost housing, it may not be appropriate to the needs and preferences of the people that it's built for. The management and maintenance, as we've seen from the cases that Lillian has just talked about, is often very poor. And that's partly because the cost of proper maintenance is higher than what's collected in rents and so on. But in any case, it's certainly an issue in public housing. The particular needs of different vulnerable groups, the disabled, the elderly, single people, and so on. The public safety and security, that's one that I think sometimes we don't realize is so important to low-income people, because, you know, what do they have to steal, right? But what little they do have is very, very important to them, and security turns out to be one of the highest, most important issues for many low-income people. So that's one. As I mentioned earlier, the social stigma and class segregation that housing, you know, putting all of the low-income people in one location brings out. And then the poor access to jobs, markets, and services generally. So how do we deal with those problems? Here's some methods that can be used to try to increase participation. First, as Lillian has pointed out, you consult with the people about what they need and what they want in their housing. And preferably you do it before you build it. But if not, at least after you've built it, involve them in discussing how it can be better used. Another good example she had there was provide more public spaces for social functions and services, especially in high-rise housing, where people can gather and become a real community. Organizing and supporting a residents' association is extremely important, particularly because of their potential to participate in the maintenance and management. Because one of the great things, I mean, for example, we all go to Singapore and we say, "What really nice that it's so clean and neat and orderly." But you think about it, in Singapore, you hardly ever see a policeman. So who does all the policing? It turns out it's the people themselves. That in Singapore, if you throw down gum or spit in the wrong place or even look at a person in the wrong way, the community will bring social pressure to bear. And so it's the civic responsibility, I think, of Singaporeans that makes Singapore so different from here. One of the things that I did a few years ago, I got invited to a conference about community participation by being put on by the World Bank, of all people. So I thought, well, if you're talking to bankers, you've got to be able to quantify things so they can understand the importance of it. So I came up with a little scheme based upon some social science research to just try to analyze community participation, and even had the audacity to call it an index. But basically what I've done is just say, who is it that participates? And you can choose one from this column and then say, okay, well, that group or persons in this column, what is it that they participate in? And then the third column, how is it that they participate in that? And you can do a pretty good analysis of a situation by choosing one from the first column, the appropriate one from the second column, then the appropriate one in the third column. You multiply those together and you'll get an index score. We used this in this workshop, this conference I was invited to, and it was interesting that even though all we had was the paper documentation about projects, there was almost no disagreement on the ranking of the participation level in all of these projects that were being discussed, except for one person who complained because in her paper or presentation, one piece of information was left out, therefore it was given a lower rank than it should have been. But basically it does give you a way not only to know what the level of participation is, but to look for what the problem is. Is the problem that vulnerable groups are not at all involved? Or is the problem that the people are merely asked to respond to a survey but actually aren't consulted? Or that even though they're consulted, that they're not really involved in the discussion, and certainly they're not involved in the approvals. So this little framework can be helpful to you if you're doing community organizing, or you're doing trying to understand why participation has not been very effective for different groups and so on. So I have a couple of cases that I just thought it might be interesting to mention. The Greenbelt Cooperative is a cooperative housing organization in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. These houses were built in early 1950s. They were built for low-income people. They're made out of cement blocks, the lowest cost construction material and methods. They were tiny, as you can see, about 15 feet across and maybe 30 feet deep. They're two-story, though. Well, these terrace houses, as they call them here, now are very desirable places because the maintenance and the management of the whole thing is so well done. This cooperative now not only collectively owns and manages its housing, they also own and manage the supermarket and the pharmacy in their community. And all of it is accessible by footpaths, so that the cars are parked on the periphery of the building, of the community. So that's an interesting case, how instead of tearing down and replacing, proper organization of the people and management by the people results in another case is Singapore. We hate to always look to Singapore for the good examples, but one of their way in which they design in spaces for children is very effective. And this is, by the way, a quote from an Australian local government magazine, pointing out that Singapore had a more child-friendly kind of high-rise buildings than they have in Australia. Then going on to the next one. Now this one, I know it's very difficult for Malaysia to learn from countries that are not as advanced as Malaysia is, but India has something called the Urban Basic Services for the Poor, and they got a lot of poor people in the cities in India. Well, this program, which has been mainly 4 elements. One is community organizing and planning together, and then selecting and training community residents as volunteers for various social programs or various management needs like nutrition, health care, non-formal education, water and sanitation, and so on. And then those volunteers become a link between the social services systems and the communities, and they help organize the community response to the social services. So because this sounds like it's just kind of little pilot project things, it's important to realize that in 1995, that's almost 20 years ago, they'd already reached 25 states, 30,000 neighborhoods, 130,000 women volunteers, and among those women volunteers, quite a number of them had run for the local municipal elections and won. So the rise of the community organizers, you see. It's not by coincidence that the President of the United States is a community organizer, because it's great training for politics. And hopefully we'll see from among the group here future politicians who rise through community organizing.